How to Think Like Old Money. Wealth Psychology explained, there is a kind of wealth that does not announce itself. It does not wear logos. It does not post receipts. It does not need to be believed because it has already been proven, not by one person, but by 3 or 4 generations of people who quietly agreed on the same thing, that money is not the goal. Money is the byproduct of a way of thinking. This is a film about that way of thinking, not about yachts or trust funds or inheritance law, though we will touch all 3, but about the psychology underneath them, the mental architecture that allows a family to hold wealth not for a decade, but for a century. Because here is the uncomfortable truth that most personal finance content will not tell you. Most fortunes do not survive their makers. Roughly 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the 2nd generation. Some 90% lose it by the 3rd. The money rarely disappears because of bad luck. It disappears because of bad psychology. Old money is not a tax bracket. It is a discipline. And like any discipline, it can be studied. Ask a financial advisor, what separates families who keep their wealth from families who lose it? And very few will mention spreadsheets. They will mention something harder to quantify: temperament. The psychologist and wealth consultant James Grubman, who has spent decades studying multi-generational families, describes new wealth and old wealth as 2 different countries with 2 different cultures. He calls it immigrants to wealth. A person who builds a fortune in their lifetime is psychologically an immigrant, arriving suddenly in a country whose customs they don't yet know. Their children, born into that country, are the first native citizens. And it is that 2nd generation, Grubman argues, that determines everything. Do they assimilate into the culture of wealth, patience, stewardship, restraint, or do they merely inherit its passport without ever learning its language? This is the first and most important idea in old money psychology. Wealth is not an event, it is a culture, and cultures are transmitted the way all cultures are transmitted, through stories, habits, and the silent modeling of adults who never explain themselves because they assume the lesson is obvious. Still watching, here is a reminder: don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insights the wealthy rarely share. Let us continue. The psychology of enough. There is a phrase that recurs, almost word for word, across interviews with multi-generational wealth holders. We were taught the money wasn't ours. We were just looking after it. This single belief that the holder of wealth is a steward rather than an owner reorganizes the entire psychology of spending. A steward does not ask, what can I afford? A steward asks, what does this asset need from me in order to outlive me? Compare this to the dopamine economy most consumers live in, where spending is a reward system. Work, earn, spend, feel good, repeat. Old money psychology deliberately starves that loop. Not through deprivation. Old money is rarely austere, but through delay. Anthropologist and lifestyle journalist Lisa Birnbach, who studied the unspoken codes of inherited wealth for her landmark book on the subject, observed that the giveaway of true old money was never extravagance. It was a kind of relaxed shabbiness: the worn leather bag, the inherited watch, the car kept a decade past its prime. Status in this world is not demonstrated by what is new. It is demonstrated by what has lasted. This produces a strange but powerful psychological inversion. In most economic life, scarcity creates anxiety. In old money culture, abundance creates patience. Because the family has already proven, across generations, that the money will still be there next year, there is no urgency to convert it into anything. The wealth doesn't need to be spent to be enjoyed. Its mere persistence is the enjoyment. This is sometimes called quiet wealth or stealth wealth, and behavioral economists have begun studying it formally. Researchers analyzing the spending patterns of multi-generational versus first-generation millionaires consistently find the same pattern. The longer wealth has existed in a family, the lower the household's visible consumption tends to be relative to its actual net worth. The money becomes less a tool for status and more a tool for time, for buying decades, not objects. Psychologists have a name for the capacity this requires, the ability to tolerate delayed reward. It is the same trait measured, famously, in Walter Mischel's marshmallow experiment at Stanford in the late 1960s. Children who could resist eating one marshmallow now in exchange for two later went on, decades later, to show better outcomes across nearly every measurable life domain: health, relationships, career stability. Old money households, whether they know the experiment or not, run a multi-generational version of it. The marshmallow is not eaten by the child. It is not eaten by the grandchild. The instruction passed down is not, "Don't spend the principal." That's the rule on paper. The instruction underneath the rule is, "You are not the last generation. Act accordingly." This single mental shift, picturing yourself as a link in a chain rather than the end of one, has been shown, in family business research, to be the single strongest predictor of whether a fortune survives. Family enterprise researchers at institutions including Northeastern University and the Family Firm Institute have repeatedly found that the businesses and fortunes that survive past the third generation are disproportionately led by people who can describe, in concrete detail, ancestors they never met. The dead, in other words, are still in the room, and their presence disciplines behavior in the present. Of course, psychology alone does not preserve a fortune. It is reinforced, almost ritualized, through legal and financial architecture designed centuries ago and refined ever since. The trust is the oldest of these tools, amitzos, dating back to medieval England, when landowners leaving for the Crusades needed someone to manage their estates in their absence without technically transferring ownership. The structure was a workaround. It has remained a workaround ever since, a way of separating control from ownership, allowing wealth to be guided by careful trustees rather than handed, unfiltered, to heirs who may not yet have absorbed the culture surrounding it. Family offices serve a similar psychological function. On paper, they are private wealth management firms serving a single family. Psychologically, they are something closer to an institutional memory, a body of professionals whose job is to remember what the family itself might forget across a generational handoff. Why this property was never sold, why this business relationship matters, why this charitable commitment was made in 1962 and is still honored. And philanthropy, often misread by outsiders purely as image management or tax efficiency, plays a third, quieter role. Giving deliberately, across generations, through a family foundation, does something to family psychology that giving alone cannot. It creates a shared project bigger than any single heir's personal consumption. It gives the family something to agree on other than money itself. And it extends the family's relevance, its name, its relationships, its access, long after any single fortune might have otherwise faded from public memory. Here is where old money psychology becomes most counterintuitive to a modern individualist sensibility. In this worldview, your most valuable asset is rarely an asset at all. It's a relationship. Sociologists call this social capital, a term popularized by Pierre Bourdieu and later expanded by Robert Putnam, and it functions, in practice, almost exactly like financial capital. It can be accumulated, it can be inherited, it compounds with time, and it can be spent down if neglected. Old money families have historically understood this with unusual clarity. The boarding school, the social club, the university, with the right reputation, these are not lifestyle choices. They are deliberate capital allocation, just allocated toward people instead of property. A child placed early among future judges, future diplomats, future CEOs is not simply being given an education. They are being given a lifetime of access that no single check, however large, could purchase directly. This is, in essence, venture investing in human relationships, made with a multi-decade time horizon, justified by the belief that connections compound just as reliably as capital, and sometimes more so, Because relationships, unlike assets, cannot be easily liquidated by a hostile creditor, a bad marriage, or an aggressive tax authority. The psychological cost. It would be dishonest in a film about psychology to leave out its shadows. Family wealth therapists, a small but growing profession, report a consistent pattern among the heirs of significant fortunes, a particular kind of identity confusion that researcher and psychologist Jamie Traeger-Muni has termed wealth identity, the lifelong project of separating one's sense of self-worth from one's net worth. Children raised inside the discipline of stewardship often describe a quiet, persistent question: would I have been loved, hired, respected, or admired if the money weren't there? It is a question that, by definition, can never be fully answered because the money is always there. This is the part of old money psychology rarely discussed in admiring profiles, that the same culture of restraint and delayed gratification that preserves a fortune across generations can also produce a peculiar kind of psychological caution, a fear of risk, of failure, of disappointing ancestors one never met. Many of the family wealth advisors interviewed for studies on this subject describe their job, candidly, as being half financial planner and half family therapist. The money is rarely the hard part. You do not need a trust fund to think like old money. You need, fundamentally, 3 psychological shifts that anyone can practice regardless of their bank balance. The first is to think in decades rather than dollars, to ask not, what can this purchase make me feel right now, but what will this decision look like in 20 years? The second is to treat consumption and identity as separate categories, to find status, increasingly, in what lasts rather than in what is new, because the things that last require almost nothing from you except patience. And the third, perhaps the most radical, is to begin thinking of yourself as a single generation in a longer story, whether that story is a family's, a community's, or simply the story of who you want to have been, looking backward at the end of a long life. Old money, in the end, is not a class. It is a habit of mind, the conviction, practiced daily, that you are not building for yourself. You are building for someone you will never meet, and trusting that, somewhere down the line, they will do the same for someone they will never meet either. That is not a secret reserved for the wealthy. It is simply a discipline most of us were never taught. If this opened your eyes, subscribe for more insights the wealthy rarely share. Let us know your thoughts on the comment section. Bello.